welcome back to Frankly Speaking. Let's call this episode 7 of the Integralist Chronicles. So tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I want to speed you up to about 1998, 99, right in that time frame. As I believe it was in January 98 that I went back to college. And I remember going back to school. I was a little older, 26, 27 years old roughly. And it was strange being kind of more socially mature now. And going to school with a bunch of kids that had just gotten out of high school, in the 18, 19, 20-year-old range that were really socially challenged culturally challenged and really they had grown up under a complete different set of values than what I was raised in. And I think also too, what was different was I was no longer in a predominantly Catholic or Italian kind of environment that I was growing into a society now that was much more, I guess, American Protestant now, away from those homogenous cultures, because I left LA. I left LA at the end of 1997. And so I went from a predominantly homogenous culture, which a lot of times was Italians and Croatians and Hispanics that had lots of Catholic values in them. And now I go into a part of the country where I leave those communities that were set up by Catholics sort of so they could congregate and protect themselves. Now I'm on the outside. I'm primarily in this Protestant indifferent world all of a sudden. And the kids that I'm going to college with now, right? I call them kids because I felt at 27 years old, 26, 27, I was older in that respect. These kids are uncatechized in any kind of religion now. They're unfamiliar with a lot of the cultural bonds that I was raised with, and these are pure white bread Americans in many respects, and that's how I saw them. Now, for my part, I respect everybody, right? And I treat everybody with human dignity. It's just I'm trying to explain the social ramifications of what I was going to and seeing. Now I'm not in this cultural enclave of sort of Catholicism anymore. I'm on the outside. And in many respects, I'm alone. I'm all alone because I do have, again, this European, Italian sort of experience in life. And I'm taking it to the outside world and trying to deal with a lot of sort of the machinations of a very liberal culture that kind of throws everything wayward to the side in terms of culture and morality and politics. And being introduced into this world of secularism, or white bread Protestantism, which is becoming more and more secularized, it was an awakening in many ways. And obviously, the most obvious, I should say, was the fact that now I'm being taught or I'm in classrooms with extremely liberal professors. Now, at this point in my life, I'm very politically minded, right? I'm listening to talk radio, I'm reading books, I'm being driven by, sort of my interest into politics. And so every classroom became a showdown of sorts, particularly being one of the few conservatives on campus. And it would be a 1-on-20, 1-on-30, 1-on-35 battle, however big the class was. Generally, it would be the professor would be the greatest obstacle. They were older, more mature, had more experience, while I'm dealing with a bunch of 18, 19-year-olds whose political formation is based upon their fallen sexual drive, because by now the culture is rotten to the core. The mores, the morals, the values have all collapsed by the late 90s. And one of the ways, or one of the signs that I saw early on was, when, and I said this in the previous cast, when pornography came out on VHS tape in the early to mid 80s, it was a game changer in many ways. That's when the addiction to pornography really went to the next level. Obviously, even before the 80s in VHS, we had the Playboys and we had the underground sort of roll tapes of pornography, things like that. But VHS brought that directly straight home in a direct manner, straight to our homes. On top of that, we have things like On TV, Select TV, and then cable eventually that now will infiltrate pornography into our home. But the hardcore porn, you still had to go, sort of behind the screen to some video store or some liquor store, whatever you had. But now that veneer was broken by the 1990s, because now it was becoming more readily available on the internet. And, even in the 80s when I was growing up, while porn was being consumed at massive amounts, there was still a sense of shame and blame. I'll go back to what I said, right? My grandparents' generation, or what I call that pre-World War II generation, they were still alive, and there were some elements of that shame and blame in the 70s and the 80s. But it's by the 90s that pre-World War II generation starts to die off, and with it, sort of the last elements of sort of shame and blame, those that were the protectors of tradition, those that were the protectors of modesty and purity, and those that would judge us by the way we behaved and the particular behaviors or activities we partook in. Now we're in the 90s. Now we're in the era of Friends. We're in the era of Murphy Brown. We're in the era of single moms and dropping kids off at daycares, and pornography is rampant. Cable TV now is shooting into all of our homes. Pornography now is through the internet. And what you begin to see is a cultural shift where the shame and blame aspect begins to die off in culture, where sin is now celebrated publicly, right? It's not underground. You're not hiding from it. You're not making sure nobody sees you anymore watching, consuming the porn or whatever it may be. Now you're just like, it's celebratory because there is no more standards. And I remember specifically, I was walking around campus one day, and the boys were starting to walk around with t-shirts that celebrated their favorite porn stars on their t-shirts. And the young ladies are not wearing clothes, things like that said something like bootylicious on them or something like that, right? Something that would celebrate their sexuality out in the open, proclaiming to the world, listen, I'm in the porn world, I'm having sex, this is the way the world is now, I'm partaking of it, I'm going to celebrate it. See, that's what I say. The difference between the 80s and the 90s may not have been so much that there was less going on in the 80s, but it was still kind of hidden in a way. Where in the 90s, especially by the late 90s, now we're celebrating openly. Sexuality is something that's now wide open and celebrated. We're sort of, no safeguards of shame and blame anymore. And I knew then, understanding where I was at that point in my life, that I knew something was changing fast, radically fast. And for me, that meant fighting the culture war. And that's what I did for the most part, taking out a lot of these social issues, things that are not popular, right? Things that I still talk about, like the abortion issue, the divorce and remarriage issue, the contraception issue, pornography issue, whatever you may have. I still talk about these things to this day. And I was talking about these things 25, 30 years ago in that respect. And those are the things that were the least popular and made me the least popular in my general surroundings. But this is some of the things you started to see. And the more you got to know people and talk to them, engage them in college, you would see not only were most of these kids now coming from broken families, tattered families, divorced families, but they themselves were divorced of any sort of morality whatsoever. The only thing they knew or understood about family was dysfunction, and family became a running joke kind of a thing, right? And it fit that whole paradigm of the grunge music thing that I was talking about, right? The ultimate white Protestant, I hate my family music, right? And that also comes along on the heels of the rap music, which was another form of grievance music. And as we know, the black family, just as the white family, had lots of problems in the inner cities with family structures, as familial structures broke down in those communities. Well, by the late 90s, we've come to a full fruition of a complete breakdown in morality. And the irony is that generation I'm talking about now in the mid to late 90s is the generation that would raise the current crop of woke culture that we now have. See, all this stuff builds upon one another. And that's what I've tried to do in this cast, is to highlight really from that pre-World War II generation to the baby boomers, to the 80s generation, Gen X, and now to the woke generation. This has been all built upon. Because really faith, religion, morality is something that's passed on family to family. It's not passed on institution to institution. It's not something that government can give you. The only thing government can really do is it could take that away from you. And it doesn't in the most, how should I say this? When the concept of religious liberty was introduced in America, we saw it as something that was to be celebrated, that we could celebrate our religious liberty. in a way where nobody can interfere with that. That's part of freedom and liberty, right? Because the founding principles of America were the byproduct of all these religious wars or religious anarchy within the realm of Protestantism. And the way they settled that, right, was through the concept of religious liberty, which in fact was not just, you get to, worship how you like, but you get to invent any new religion you want. That's why it was argued that the concept of religious liberty is not just a conscience act, like many people have said. It's actually, it goes beyond that, and we've seen how Americans have sort of lived up to the precepts of religious liberty, and that is by sort of radically shifting and altering morality to the point where we now make up our gods to justify our fallen human nature and our sins. And this had come to a full fruition by the late 90s, in my opinion. Obviously, it was happening in other generations, but really by the late 90s. And so here you have, again, a broken generation of kids who were not getting catechized in the faith, had no moral formation at home because the family was broken at the end of the day. And here's the other disturbing trend that I noticed. Those on the political right, especially those, for example, on talk radio, for example, many of these guys would preach sort of these indifferent ideas of morality and how they're important, but they would never push it because of these limits that we have as a nation in regards to the principles of limited government, right? It goes back to the foundational principles of American morality, which is what? You do you, I do me. As long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other. Because that was really the basis of American morality from the very beginning. I understand there were state churches in the beginning. I understand it was generally a much more religious culture, but we set up sort of the environment for all of this to eradicate, for all of this to kind of disappear. And that's what we've been living through as Americans for a long time. The Enlightenment was an attempt to erase true faith and true religion. It only took, a couple hundred years, but eventually it gets there. And so with the right, it's interesting because they've accepted this idea of indifferentism. And then you start to, you got these kind of hardcore principles in the political right of the philosophy when it's set within itself and how it argues with the left. But at the same time, a lot of these individuals within the right movement were broken products of the culture themselves that came from broken families themselves. And what you begin to see is a lot of these people on the right that argue for these extreme forms of freedom and liberty are actually supporting their own sins at the end of the day. I'm not going to name any names here, but you begin to see that really with a lot of talk show hosts, and they're publicly proclaimed failure when it comes to marriages themselves and how they fail to live up to the vows of marriage. Again, divorce being that byproduct that destroys the family, right? And this is something I began to notice, and you would see the political right begin to water down all these moral issues as the country became more and more and more and more morally backwards in that respect. And now we have generation on generation that's no longer catechized in the faith anymore. They don't understand the true principles of morality, and everything on the political right now becomes sort of this quasi-libertarian-esque kind of ideology where it all becomes about money and my own personal morality, which of course morality isn't personal. As I said before, if he's a public god, then he's owed public devotion and public honor. But for the right, who doesn't want to get bogged down on these principles of religious principles and how we determine, which true religion and which is not true religion and all this indifferentism, it's easy for them to say, okay, you do you, I do me. You pick your own God, I pick my own God. But again, that breaks down basic standards of uniformity within society and what we've seen. In that 90s generation, we're seeing that people are picking their morals. They're picking their own personal gods, and a lot of them are not picking the one God of sacred tradition, that which was handed on to us by our ancestors. They're picking their own personal religions, and a lot of that is extreme leftism. And people are now publicly celebrating pornography and porn stars as sort of a virtue in and of itself. That's what we began to see in the late 90s. And again, all due to the breakdown of the family. And then in 2000, we get into the George W. Bush administration, which was, well, that was an interesting time in and of itself. Even while I was seeing all these things at the time, I kept telling myself, okay, all right, understand people are different. We got to work with Protestants. We got to work with this broad tent approach that we have in the Republican Party, conservative movements. And at the end of the day, we got to get across the finish line, which is what? 50+1. That's what democracy is, right? And living in California, being born and raised there, liberalism at that time was starting to really dominate. That's when California politics was heading far left. And it wouldn't be soon after that California became a liberal juggernaut in this greater political system and this greater political discourse. Remember, California through the 70s and 80s could still be counted on at times for the Republican Party in the electoral vote. But by the late 90s, early 2000s, it was starting to go. And so this is the mess we had to deal with at that time. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, all right, we've had 8 years of Bill Clinton. He's been a very liberal president. We've had a disgraceful act of him having sex with a subordinate 20 years of his age. It was a massive scandal. The Republicans tried to take him out, but he survived. And in fact, his approval ratings went up because the economy was good. And what we learned at that time is people don't care if we have presidents in the White House acting in the most immoral manner as long as the economy is good. And that's where the Republican Party really shifted, because now the whole idea of the silent majority that was around in the 70s and the 80s, that idea was dead. Morality was broken in America, and the Republican Party started to surrender the culture. And the more you argued in favor of cultural issues, the more you were told, get over it, Frank. The culture war is lost. Let's just focus on economics. And here comes George W. Bush, right? And what was fascinating was at that time, I was still not wanting to see the reality of the things that were actually happening on the ground. I mean, I saw them, I acknowledged them, but I kept telling myself, what choice do we have? What choice do we have? Do we want far leftists running the government? That isn't good. Do we want to go down this quasi-Marxist socialist path? And so, see, and that's the thing about as an integralist now is the idea that we only have two choices. How convenient for the system. How convenient if you never want true change. How convenient if you want to suppress the counter-revolution, right? And that's what liberalism has done in this two-party system. It has avoided the ability to actually counter-revolutionize the nation and bring it back to any true justice of principles and morality. And so, okay, we got to go vote. And listen, what's interesting is if you talk to conservatives, and even to this day, even no matter how badly they've been beat at the polls, no matter how badly the country has gravitated to the left, and the Democrats and the left continue to pass all these bills that shift the country further and further and further and further to the left, if you suggest the idea, any inkling that somehow the system doesn't work, and what's the point of voting, and maybe you don't want to vote, they will look at you with daggers like you are the greatest heretic that the world has ever known. How dare you? What is wrong with you? Kind of a thing, right? How dare you sit by and let the enemy win? So you become the enemy. It's not the system that is flawed, because the system in and of itself was given to us by the founding fathers, who in this classical liberal paradigm are seen as sort of modern day saints, as if they have a divine sort of presence or a divine calling that they've passed on to the nation, right? Never mind, we've had no divine revelation that's ever revealed that. We're just supposed to believe it because, see, that is the narrative in the folk tales we have told ourselves throughout history. A lot of these stories are like from the early 20th and late 19th centuries, this American ethos that was created by certain writers, right, at the time to give us a narrative and a description of what America is and who we are, because we have no inherent culture. So we have to tell ourselves these folk tale stories of the past that oftentimes make no sense to most of us. But what they do is they build us up as a nation and give us some basic principles of freedom and liberty and the right to self-determination. And we fight all over the world in order to spread freedom and liberty, right? So these ideas are ingrained in the Republican Party, ingrained in the political right. And one of the reasons is because there is nowhere else to go. And that was the problem that I was finding very early on as I was studying politics. So I jumped on the George W. Bush bandwagon because I wanted to believe that George W. Bush was a conservative, right? I'd been studying Ronald Reagan a lot and the Reagan Revolution. The Gipper, I really liked the Gipper for the most part. Wasn't perfect, but I liked him. And here we are, right? Because in 1979, it's Ronald Reagan talking about how we need to abolish the teachers union, the NEA, and that is the union's effect on kids and the leftist indoctrination that was happening through the unions. And by the time we get to 2003, I think is what it is, and George W. Bush is in power, and all of a sudden we got No Child Left Behind, which is actually more government intrusion into the educational system in America. We didn't take Ronald Reagan's vision of stripping power away from the government in regards to education. We increased it under George W. Bush. These are Republican presidencies with different ideas, and that are shifting. And I remember, going down to the local Riverside County Republican Party office. They would give me the signs and the bumper stickers. I get 40, 50 at a time, and I'd be all over, Riverside County, nailing these things on telephone poles and fences and things like that. I was pumped up. I was a young conservative and things of that nature. And I was having a good time up till 1, 2 in the morning. And I was just excited, man. We got to get these liberals out. We're gonna beat people with hearts and minds, right? We're gonna change hearts and minds, like Russians talk about, and take back America from the far left. And politics does that. And I think part of it is because politics, I think in large part, is like kind of like fantasy sports, right? You got your team and you want to win. You want to celebrate at the end of the day. And there's a lot of that happens in politics. And I got caught up in that. Don't get me wrong, the bottom line was truth for me in trying to get real changes to the nation, especially as it felt, backwards morally, obviously. And I really got behind it. I will say this much. I remember during the primary of that 2000 election, when before George W. Bush won the nominee, I remember George W. Bush's name being sort of boasted about all over the media as he's the favorite. This is the guy, he's a governor, he's from Texas, he's run that state well, he's got a family name, right? The Bush family that's when it really becomes a dynasty in many respects. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I followed politics 4 or 5 years. I don't understand where this guy George W. Bush came from. I know he's a governor, I get that, but is he a conservative? I don't know. And so when it came to the primaries in the year 2000, the guy I fell in love with, and called me crazy, I loved Alan Keyes. He was a Catholic, staunch moral conservative, very articulate. Yeah, he was black, and I had no issues with that, right? I mean, for me, I'm an idea guy. I don't care about that. Now, Alan Keyes won, I think, 2 to 3% of the vote. That's it. And here comes George W. Bush, who runs away with the nomination for the most part. I'm thinking to myself, who is this guy? I didn't even really know who he was, because it wasn't like he was brandied about on conservative talk radio a whole lot at that time. There was other guys that were considered more conservative. And I started to wonder to myself at that time, that's when certain things were clicking in my mind. Is there more insider jibber jabber or shenanigans going on within the realm of Democratic politics? Because I never understood the nomination of George W. Bush, especially when you got a nation of supposed conservatives that are being led by talk radio, the conservative thinkers. Fox News came out in '96. This guy just kind of comes out of nowhere. He's a governor, right? And maybe it was the safe pick. Maybe it was. But it wasn't that guy as a young conservative that I was looking at. In fact, there was 3 or 4 or 5 other guys I probably would have chose before him at the time. I don't remember who they were. But I'm like, okay, we're getting a guy that I just really don't know and I don't understand. So, but he's a Republican. He must be a conservative. He's sold that way to a certain extent, right? And I started campaigning for him in an unofficial capacity. I wasn't like down, signing up, sign me up kind of thing. I just go down there, take the signs, and start putting them out, the bumper stickers, handing them out to friends, families, things like that, get the word out. And I was excited. I was enamored to be part of the political system. This is all new to me in many respects. And George W. Bush won that election. And that's when the Republican Party, I began to see some things, again, this neocon wing of the party. And after 9/11, and we decided to go all over the world and do what we had to do. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have had a response to 9/11, but there's some questions there because the entire ideology of the neocons is to spread democracy all over the world, which at the time I thought made sense. I bought those arguments at the time that, those nations that are democratic, and if you spread democracy, democracies don't go to war against one another, right? We haven't fought a war against Europe since the end of World War II because we spread democracy in there. Now, we don't acknowledge the damage we did with democracy with certain countries there, but that's for another show. We haven't fought a war against Japan. We neutered them, right? We have this kind of, tough attitude, or this rugged idea that we're Americans, right? We spread our values, they're the greatest values in the history of the world. And if we just spread them all over the world and Americanize the whole world, we'll live in peace, harmony, and live in great prosperity. But I think reflecting back at the time, it was one of the great mistakes, and really one of the great sins of America, to impugn their values on everybody else. And the primary culprit is that as Americans, we have no true religion. And as a result of that, we have no true culture. We're a bunch of individuals walking around trying to serve ourselves and trying to find these economic interests that keep some kind of peace and order within the realm of our own country. But when you look at nations across the ocean, especially those that have ancestral lines that go back for thousands and thousands of years, they don't value the same things we do. They don't value these abstract ideas of freedom and liberty. They don't value just the good almighty dollar to buy trinkets and to buy materialism and to worship at the altar of materialism. A lot of these nations, a lot of these cultures, again, they have their own set of beliefs, and they value other things more than, again, these abstract ideas of liberty and all the materialism that Americans have come to worship. Because in many respects, I think you can very easily argue at this point that America is a nation without a soul, precisely because all we're doing is pursuing material ambitions at the end of the day. And that was sort of soullessness I began to see in the political right, that could not make a cohesive argument of true principles of morality while telling us that the greatness of America is all the cheap crap we buy from China and how we all live this prosperous life. And America's greatness became associated with this economic prosperity and nothing else. The culture didn't matter, the faith didn't matter, nothing else mattered but making the money in America. And that's from the right, not from the left necessarily. And see, this is where I say there's not really a whole lot of difference between the left and the right when you break it down, because both are in that realm of that sort of, what would you call it, that materialistic dialectic, or what, I forgot what the word is now, but it's materialism at the end of the day that runs both the left and the right. Now, how you achieve that materialism is they're at odds. But at the end of the day, they both celebrate the material world, and they put the spiritual world and culture on the back burner for everybody to decide for themselves. And what happens when you put religion, true religion, on the back burner and culture on the back burner, everything else breaks down from there. And that's why, even though we like to celebrate that with this great economic power, we've done it on the backs of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and our great-great-great-grandchildren, right? We sold ourselves on this idea that we're the greatest, most wealthiest nation in the history of the world, but we've done it by printing funny money, by playing games with money, and ultimately doing it off massive debt, which I question now whether that's true prosperity, right? We have to question that. We may all live good, we may all have these comforts and these pleasures, but is it real? What happens, let's say 20 years or 50 years or 100 years, it all collapsed on top of us? Can you say that America was great? Was it ever great? If it all collapses, because everything really hinges on the material success. So in other words, America is on borrowed time. We know that because these debts are impossible to continue to just pile up. The moment that debt, the moment that materialistic world comes crashing down, what will be the greatness of America that many conservatives boast about? What will it be? Culture? No. Architecture, beauty? Not really. Faith, religion? No. People that sacrifice everything for their faith, the martyrs of the faith, what would it be? Everything is premised on this materialistic notion that we worship at. And that really took to the next step in that George W. Bush era. And as we begin to spread democracy all over the world, and I begin to see the massive compromises that the political right was making when it came to culture, when it came to faith, and when it came to true principles of morality. You saw that coming really to a head in many ways. And we would kind of stumble along for 8 years with George W. Bush. They would claim it was great economic times until the collapse, of course, right? Until that 2008 crash. And that set us up for Barack Obama, which is another era in itself, which wound up being disastrous. But the fact that we're here now, it's a series of mistakes that we've made. And while many Americans want to look at it from this political paradigm, I would suggest the problems are in culture and problems are in true faith and true religion that we've never had in America. And now we're trouncing around the world, looking to start a fight, a war at every corner of the world where we want to impugn these same soulless values in these other nations that have cultures and languages and morality different than ours long before America even existed. But somehow we believe we're better, right? That's what we do as Americans, when in fact our own nation is falling apart now right before our very eyes. And I'm not the one saying this. It's conservatives telling me this right now, right? I don't know what happened to America. America's collapsing. This is not the America I know. Okay, well, you were warned a long time ago. What's the answer? The same left and right kind of politics that have gotten us here? The same principles? I don't know anymore. So, this is the political right, but the year 2000, it takes a radical shift. It's neocons wanting to go all over the world. It's these abstract ideas. There's no true principles of morality anymore. And really, in many ways, American politics, I believe that's when it becomes a giant social club up at the top. And I still find it interesting to this day how these presidents all kind of get along in a giant club. They all have kind of the same ideas. And I think maybe Donald Trump is a little different, even though he's far from perfect. But politics at the very top, at DC, the presidency, the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, it's a giant social club. They live in their own world, right? It's kind of like that movie, The Hunger Games, right? It's the capital, right? They're district number one. The other 12 districts, or 12 districts, they're looking at District 1 saying, what has happened there? Where we're all starving out here. There's no sense of reality left in politics. And why would there be? If there was no true principles of morality ever established at the very top of the nation, if the nation was never forced to acknowledge eternal truths and proper and just morality, all in favor of this indifferentism, why would you think that kind of a nation would exist long term? What, was it going to magically stumble onto true principles of morality, faith, religion, God, culture? No, we've been descending since the founding. That's what we've done. And I don't want to hear about this argument how it all worked up until the Civil War. Come on, that's ridiculous. Simply because we didn't. You're talking about a period of time before the Civil War was before the Industrial Revolution. Everything just moved much more slowly. But those errors of Protestantism and differentism were already spreading in the nation. We just don't have the 24-hour news cycle or social media to report on how those things were, were spreading. Listen, I'm in Utah. The Mormons head for Utah, 1830s? Nobody bothered it for almost a century. They could do whatever they want out here. Nobody was reporting on them. It was their own little world, whether it's right or wrong. This was happening all over the country, especially with a lot of these preachers, these campfire preachers down in the South. And you saw these little wars between the evangelicals and this new wave of Protestantism, right, which was a little bit different, right, breaking the shackles of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church, the problems that Calvinists and the Puritans presented with their radical theology and their kind of ghostly ideas of material worship themselves that they incorporated in the faith. Where do you think the health and wealth gospel comes from? Right? It comes from that branch of Christian theology. right? And when you got a nation where there is no correction of moral theology and people are allowed to believe what they want, like a health and wealth gospel, that's when you begin to have a lot of problems. And true faith and true religion begins to die at that point. And once you do that, your culture is broken, and it's only a matter of time until your political system becomes abjectly corrupt. So now we're spinning through the George W. Bush era for 8 years, between 2000 and 2008. The country's becoming more soulless. We're fighting wars all over the place. And the moral degradation is just now going off the cliff, because now we're prepping. Now that generation, that woke generation we're dealing with now, that's the generation that's being born in that era. And, you know, we got a situation, we got a bunch of parents that don't know how to be parents. They've lost their moral compass. And now we're about to take America to the next step. And that's the Looney Tunes we're dealing with today. That happened under George W. Bush, by the way, a Republican presidency. And not that I'm blaming him for all the cultural disaster, but he did not help. He did not help. That's my point there. And so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I think I cut off here. For now, we're going to end off somewhere in the 2000s. I'll pick up from there next time. I want to thank you for joining me. Frankly speaking, this is episode 7, or should I say volume 7, of the Integralist Chronicles. This is Frank signing off. Good night, everybody.